Okay, I assume everyone can see my screen. So hi everyone, my name is Delvin, and I'm coming from a slightly different perspective to some of our other speakers today. So I'm really excited about some of the stuff that Patricia and Audra have shared, and I'm sure we'll hear from Veronica as well. And yeah, so I'm coming from a slightly more applied research perspective. So I'm based within the Faculty of IT at Monash University in Melbourne. And I'm based within a group called Action Lab, which does community research and participatory research with organizations and NGOs. So I'm just gonna, let me just, my slides aren't working. I'm just gonna put this on the screen for a quick second, because I think this might resonate with some of you on this call in terms of why some of us might be here, even on this call, and what we're expecting to get out of this. So usually when I say research, it tends to conjure up images in people's minds, particularly when I speak to practitioners or people from NGOs. And, it tends to be this kind of a perception of research coming from this kind of extractive, treating communities and partners as data collection sources. Well, you'll be pleased to know that because of our commitment to kind of applied research, we draw more on those kind of participatory research traditions, which have been going for quite a number of decades. So by no means nothing I'm going to talk about or draw on will be brand new to some of you. So the challenge, as I understand it, in terms of why we're here on this call, is the challenge of innovation, and particularly an innovation we've been forced to do in light of the global situation that we find ourselves in. So undoubtedly, a lot of what Patricia says about complexity and not rushing headlong into a new approach or being quick to dispense the recommendations, but actually recognizing the complexity of the challenge is very, very important. But having said that, I have 10 minutes to quickly bring in a technical and a research perspective into some of these conversations. So apologies if it seems like I'm simplifying a lot of stuff, but I'm really happy to take in critical questions and in the discussions afterward, and also by email if you want to reach out to me. So the challenge, as far as I see it, is, how do we do innovation in a way that works with the new aid environment? And those of us who are engaging in these conversations, both within Australia and overseas, and particularly with the big players in the development scene, the Western European and Northern American actors, a lot of us are wrestling with the new reality of what it means to do aid and M&E in particular. So some of the ideas that I'll be bringing on are very particular to a participatory tradition. So what I say I hope will work very much in tandem with some of the things that Audra has been talking about and some of the other ideas that we'll be hearing today. So this is by no means, choose this one as opposed to the other ones, but it's about how does this complement some of the other things we'll talk about. And the ideas in particular are about leveraging the existing capacity of local partners and NGO staff and community members, and also about utilizing technologies that these members at the most local level have access to. In particular today, I'm going to be talking about social media and audiovisual methods. But I'm just going to add this caveat and saying that in some scenarios, these are totally inappropriate. And I saw this question coming from Tim earlier in the chat about the most remote communities. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I'm going to talk very broadly, but in some scenarios, we've piloted approaches that have used more telephone calls and running processes with local NGOs that utilize telephony and conference calling, and how that's used for data collection and also peer learning. But I'm going to draw more on these two well-established approaches that we've done recently. And the first one I'm going to talk about is this approach called What Futures. This was a project we did with the IFRC where they wanted to engage 6,000 global volunteers in doing learning about setting the strategy for 2030. So IFRC were in conversations about developing Strategy 2030, and they wanted to hear the views of their youth volunteers. So we supported them in this engagement by using structured WhatsApp engagements and conversations, and we're able to get a lot of rich responses. And one of the interesting things that we saw, which we didn't really tap into because of the scope of that research, was while we were doing this engagement, there was this huge earthquake that happened in Mexico 3 years ago. And suddenly we saw all these groups just coming alive in terms of, what from an outsider perspective, it's data collection, but from what's happening on the community level is just communities doing what they always do. They share their messages of hope and alerts with each other, and often it's not done in a kind of text-based communication. A lot of it's done using voice notes and videos and media. And a lot of the reasons why we shy away from those approaches is because of questions about how do we harness that richness, and it's quite unpredictable, and how would it fit in within this kind of linear workflow that we use that needs to condense into a report, and reporting to donors and learning. So a lot of the work that we do with our community and NGO partners is about structuring processes and through social media, through digital technologies, in a way that they can use them. And this is something that I think Patricia also touched upon, where even when you do monitoring and evaluation, there are big questions about, how do you take this forward? Who does the analysis? And in particular, I think this question is best approached by talking about a concrete process like participatory video. So we designed this approach to participatory video based on some of the challenges of how it's done currently. It's very expensive to get PV consultants to fly out and sourcing the video equipment and doing the training. And often it's kind of, a few people who are skilled carry out the kind of PV production process, and they do their best to facilitate communities in taking part in it. So working with the IFRC and the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies of Indonesia, Namibia, and Egypt, we came up with this approach, which used mobile phones or tablets to capture, edit, and create community filmmaking. And all of the processes that I just mentioned were done by community members with minimal training. Now, there's obviously questions about access and why we're using these technologies. Just to say that we're using these technologies in contexts where they wanted that. So it wasn't an IFRC imposition on these national societies, but they wanted to use rich media, and they have a budget for a few devices. So how can we use that best? Now, in the new COVID environment, we're having conversations with some national societies about how we adapt this to make it community friendly and social distancing friendly. So we're right in the middle of these approaches we're working on, in terms of how do we enable the same process, but using a mixture of mixed method communication. So can, especially in national societies where volunteers are still going to the field, but doing approaches in a social distance way. So what does that mean for enabling communities to do this in a social distance way? Those are approaches we're trialing right now, and I've put the link up on the screen now. So please do keep following the updates on what that's how that's going and what's happening with that. So returning to the the broader point I touched upon at the start of my talk, this is a question about what do we mean by digital transformation, and what does it mean to use digital and all these new methods? And I think that was something really fascinating that Audra touched upon, where innovation doesn't necessarily have to mean let's bring in a whole bunch of new approaches in or new technologies in, but it's about leveraging what's already being used in community contexts, and let's look at what communities are already using. And we won't be surprised to find out that while these might be innovative for those coming from an outside perspective, for communities there who've been practicing a lot of this kind of insider innovation and resilience, these are kind of old hat approaches. And I remember when I first came across this term in the ICT for development space about human-mediated technology. And that was just a fancy term for communities often use technology in groups. And if you'd asked a 10-year-old me, how do you watch cricket? That's the answer I would tell you. You would go to the neighbor's house who has a telly, and there'll be 10 families gathered around a single television. And then suddenly, what was seemingly an insight in this kind of digital divide conversation, 15 years later, when I was studying about it, was actually a built-in resilience method all along. Yeah, so it's important that we have these conversations, and important that we even ask ourselves, what do we mean by innovation, and how do we address complexity in these particular contexts, and not just bring in technologies for the sake of doing a job in a much easier way. So I'm going to end my talk there, and looking forward to the conversations that we're going to have. Thank you.